I was randomly flicking through things the other day and I came across something to do with the Portuguese Grand Prix. I don't know if it had anything to do with the Mansell and Piquet video, but as I've said several times now, all the videos have just blurred into one over the many years I've been doing this. So I got thinking, there are a lot of countries on that list that I was looking at that had Grand Prix that now don't. Take the French Grand Prix as an example. It's not on the calendar anymore. The last time it was in 2022 and it was at Paul Ricard. But if you are, let's say, of a certain vintage like myself, then you'll remember it being primarily at Manicourt. That's if you can actually remember any races there, because with the exception of 1999 and maybe 2004, they were pretty boring. 1999 being the race where it rained and Frentzen won, and in 2004, that was the day that Michael did the four-stopper to overhaul Alonso. But there's other countries that have had and then lost Grand Prix even though they were considered a tradition by the time they left the calendar. Malaysia, for example, running between 1999 and 2017. Argentina is also gone, running its last race in 1998. Germany, like France, is one that you would think would be on the calendar every year, but it isn't, as well as South Africa and I guess Turkey to throw in there as well. But also on that list is Portugal. Now Portugal did come back for a couple of years during the pandemic, helping to pad out the calendar as different countries had different rules regarding what to do on arrival in said country, which is why Australia went and some countries were closed completely. But the Portuguese Grand Prix was on the calendar for 1958, 1959 and 1960, being held twice at Boa Vista with a race at Monsanto in the middle. Moss won in Portugal in 58 and 59 and Jack Brabham won the final one for a bit in 1960. Although I should point out, just as some extra information, that with the exception of 1956, Boa Vista and Monsanto had hosted several non-championship rounds from 1951 to 1957, with Ferrari dominating those early 50s non-championship races before Cooper and Vanwall dominated the official World Championship rounds, if you want to call them that. Well, I say Cooper and Vanwall. Cooper won 2 of those 3 races, so really it's Cooper dominating. But I digress. After which, the Portuguese Grand Prix was relegated to non-championship calendars, with 3 races being held in 1964, 5 and 6 before going on a long break. And as it so happens, Motorsport magazine contributor Matt Bishop has just written a piece about those old non-championship races, just when I was about to. Oh well, it is what it is. But then in 1984, the Portuguese Grand Prix found itself a new home, much like the US Grand Prix found itself a new home when it went to Watkins Glen. And that new home for Portugal was Estoril. Even though 1984 was the first season for the track, the first races were being held there in the 1970s. But like many tracks around the world, the track fell into disrepair and the facilities weren't great, and the company that owned the circuit was taken over by the Portuguese government in the late 70s, which meant that the work could get done if it was to attract the big-time drivers and teams of Formula 1, and the Portuguese Rally often had a stage there. The circuit looked like this when Formula 1 returned to Portugal in 1984. A little different to how it is now, but not too dissimilar. Turns 1 and 2 were fast, and in a way the layout of Estoril, Barcelona and Portimao have striking similarities in places. Turn 3 was a long uphill right-hander that led into a much tighter turn 4, with a straight and kink that led to parabolica interior. But as you can work out, there's a fair few slow corners here, although the final sector was a little bit faster. And then you've got that long final corner being tight on the entry and tight on the exit a little bit as well, that pushed the left-hand side tyres to the limit. On the Formula 1 games of the time, it was a relatively easy circuit to learn. On the original Jeff Crammond Grand Prix game, I turned hundreds of laps around Estoril simply because it was an easy layout to remember. But there were some issues with the place. The track had been built on a rocky plateau about 5.5 miles from the town of Estoril, so in some places on the track, particularly around turns 2 and 3, there wasn't that much room for runoff. Maurice Hamilton, a prominent F1 journalist, was standing there during the 1984 event, and that's where Gerhard Berger kicked up the gravel so violently a marshal was injured, and then destroyed the barrier when he crashed into it. Hamilton was standing on the exit of turn 2 later on and watched the McLaren go past before being missed by mere inches by a flying front wing. It really was one of those, if they submitted it for the calendar today, it would be a solid no types of deals. But it was a fast track with a lot of elevation change that the drivers and fans tended to enjoy. And it had its moments. Practice for the first race there was an absolute washout, and the amount of police there relative to the crowd size was incredibly heavy-handed. During the rain delay, some mechanics were playing football when one of the local Rozzers decided that fun was not allowed and tried to confiscate said football. This led Nigel Mansell to hop over the wall and say, "Excuse me sir, my moustache would like a word with you." Later on, reports came out that one of the mounted police officers had been bitten by his horse. On the arse. But at the same time, that race saw a Formula 1 season end by its narrowest ever margin. Lauda won the '84 title by a half point, and then the following year, in more pouring rain, Senna, in his Lotus, won his first race, in a performance that puts Donington 1993 to shame. Then there was Nigel getting black flagged for reversing in the pit lane and deciding to carry on driving in 1989, ultimately crashing into Senna like an idiot, and then Riccardo Patrese' scary backflip in 1992. But at the final Portuguese Grand Prix at Estoril there was the pass, but unlike the one at Laguna Seca, there weren't any brakes involved. Or corner cutting. By this point, Estoril really was under the cosh. If the internet existed then like it does now, there could have been a site called Has Estoril Failed a Safety Inspection Today.co.uk or something along those lines, because it was failing them quite often. And I should mention that back in 1984, those crash barriers were primitive at best, and they were entering turn 1 at around 180 miles an hour. If there was a blowout or a suspension failure going in, Formula 1 could have had a fatal. But in 1994, a raft of safety changes were made as part of the knee-jerk response to the 2 deaths at Imola and, well, everything else that happened that year. Key among which being a Mickey Mouse chicane added to the final sector that added a few extra metres to the circuit. It has to be noted here that the old 7 to 9 section was incredibly narrow, and there was the possibility of a track blockage if there was a crash. But it's stuff they didn't think of, or just had that classic Homer Simpson mentality of, could get hurt, there's a chance they won't. And Estoril had been a happy hunting ground for Williams over the last few years, so Williams was expected to win again, even with that all-conquering FW18. Patrese had won in 1991, Mansell in 1992, Schumacher interrupted the run in 1993, but Hill put Williams back on top in 1994, with David Coulthard winning for the Oxfordshire team in 1995. Yeah, DC drove for Williams. I think that gets forgotten sometimes. But the FW18 was by far the best all-round car that season. Benetton and Ferrari had done well at tracks that played to the car's strengths, but at a jack-of-all-trades track, and assuming the weather was dry, the Williams was just going to destroy everybody. And with Estoril being a testing paradise that the teams used quite often, Williams was, well, still expected to dominate. Damon Hill could have had the championship sewn up at the previous round at Monza, but he hit one of those tyre stacks that the FIA had installed at the chicanes to prevent curb hopping and busted his suspension, this happening between the second chicane and the Lesmos. Villeneuve had also bungled that race, missing one of the chicanes and damaging his floor, handing a win to Schumacher and Ferrari on home turf. Williams had already secured the Constructors' Championship in Hungary, so all that was left was the battle for the Drivers' Championship. Hill and Villeneuve entered the Portuguese Grand Prix with the same tally they'd left Monza with because neither driver scored. Hill had 81 points and Villeneuve had 68. So Hill had one hand on the title, but the errors made at Monza were going to catch up with him if he did it again. Hill also had bad races at Spain, where Williams fitted in with a dry setup in pissing rain, and also at Spa, where he finished 5th after Williams made a hash of the pit stops behind the safety car. Schumacher meanwhile was in 3rd place on 49 points, so a long way back, with Alesi and Hakkinen in 4th and 5th. Practice had Schumacher setting the initial pace, with Hill's Williams in 2nd and Katayama's Tyrrell in 3rd, surprisingly enough, although some at the time pointed towards glory runs so Ken could secure some engine deals or sponsorship deals before the season ended. When the Saturday session started, Schumacher was once again fastest, but 2 Williams cars were directly behind and weren't showing what they were fully capable of yet. And then, in qualifying, the inevitable happened. It was almost Ferrari's day, and it could have been a session where things were messed right up. There were threats of rain, especially given that weather forecasting wasn't as good then as it is now, and Schumacher set the provisional pole time. Everyone out there was trying to get their bankers in just in case it did rain, and while Schumacher had drawn first blood, Irvine went through and stuck his car on pole. If it did rain at that point, Irvine would have been the most talked about man in the paddock. But Hill came through and took the pole spot by over half a second, while Villeneuve slotted in behind. The track then went quiet as everybody waited to see if it was going to rain or not rain, and then Berger went out to show everybody that the track was still pretty good, so everybody else went out. Berger, Schumacher and Alesi all went faster than Villeneuve, and Villeneuve was making mistakes and couldn't improve on his time, so he was languishing down in a provisional 5th place. With 15 minutes left and some tweaks to the setup, because you could do that back then, Villeneuve engaged beast mode and set out to try and beat Hill. He was faster in the first sector, marginally down in the second, but absolutely ragged his Williams through the final few corners to cross the line just .009 slower than the other Williams. When the two cars went out to do their final runs, it had started raining, so there was going to be no showdown. Hill had taken pole by less than 60 centimetres, with Alesi lining up 3rd, the Michael 4th, Berger 5th, Irvine 6th, Hakkinen 7th, Coulthard 8th, Barrichello 9th and Brundle in 10th. But the close time had slightly rattled Damon. Villeneuve had pulled it out the bag when he absolutely had to, but both drivers thought that the other one would have gone faster if they'd got that extra lap. But the other teams were not surprised. Schumacher said the Ferrari was struggling for traction out the slower corners, while the Benettons were struggling elsewhere. Those 4 cars behind Villeneuve were separated by a little over 2/10, with just over 1/10 separating Michael, Gerhard and Eddie. There was not much in it at all, and with Benetton and Ferrari fighting for second in the Constructors' Championship, they could not be separated. So while the 2 Williams cars might have pulled away as they often did, the battle was really hotting up for best of the rest. Meanwhile, the McLarens were screwed by that Mickey Mouse section at the end of the lap because their chassis just couldn't handle it, and the straights weren't long enough for the Mercedes to stretch its legs. On top of this, Hakkinen almost ran over a dog during practice. At the back of the field were the 2 Minardis, the Italian underdogs now occupying the rear of the field most races because 40 had disappeared after the British Grand Prix. And right at the back was Giovanni Lavaggi, who was a staggering 5 seconds off the pace. If you thought that Latifi, Mazepin and that lot were slow, Lavaggi was something else, and he'd play a big part in this race as well. When the 5 lights went out, Hill got a good start and covered off Alesi into turn 1. That's because Alesi had beaten Villeneuve off the line, and so had Schumacher. So Villeneuve was now in 4th place and had a lot of work to do, while Hill just simply buggered off into the distance. By the end of lap 16, Hill was 13 seconds ahead of Alesi. Estoril was a pain in the back bottom to overtake at. Turn 1 was too fast to sling it up the inside, and really only Villeneuve had any proper experience of doing such a thing because of racing on the ovals. Villeneuve was struggling to find a way past the Ferrari and had to basically put his money where his very loud mouth was. He told the team that it might be possible to overtake around the outside of the final corner if he had to, but everybody at Williams said, "You can try, but we're not peeling you off the wall if you stack it." Lavaggi's Minardi had been a menace to the front runners all weekend. Cars and drivers like that were the reason the 107% rule existed, and Lavaggi had failed to qualify at the German and Belgian Grand Prix, making him the only driver other than the 240s to fall foul of that rule. He had finished 10th at Hungary, but is labelled as spun off, so it looks like one of those 90%ers. And when he made his debut for Pacific the year before, he was 35 years old. Johnny Carwash had already seen Hill and Alesi go through, but now he had the battle between Schumacher and Villeneuve behind him, and the Williams was hounding the Ferrari all the way. But Lavaggi held them up for several corners as he seemed to have no clue that they were there. As the blue and red car came out of the right-hander that leads to the final corner, Villeneuve got a better exit than the Michael because Schumacher lifted, and Villeneuve went onto the dirty side of the road with the throttle mashed to the floor. Villeneuve was on the outside, Schumacher was on the inside, with Schumacher lifting a couple of times to prevent him washing into the Williams. Villeneuve was then able to use the slipstream of the Minardi in front of him to edge in front of Schumacher to the point where he was able to pull out from behind the Minardi and get into turn 1 into the lead, lapping the Minardi in the process and obviously clearing Schumacher. What Villeneuve had done is he'd given the Michael a lesson in oval racing on a road course and caught Michael completely by surprise. It's definitely the overtake of 1996, and I think it's one of the greatest overtakes in Formula 1 history, although I'll leave that for you lot to argue about in the comments. Villeneuve was up to 3rd. He then had Alesi up the road and had Hill to try and overhaul as well. He had to win the race to keep his title hopes alive and was going after it hand over fist. Villeneuve then supposedly said, "I told you it could be done," on the radio afterwards. Villeneuve pitted on lap 18, but Damon had pitted on lap 17. Crucially for Villeneuve though, Damon had caught the back of a battle between Rosset and Katayama and lost time. 6 seconds to be precise. Villeneuve then took another 2 seconds out of Damon just on pace alone. The gap went back up slightly as JV got to traffic, but it was still manageable, and then Damon dropped off massively as his second stint came to an end, pitting on lap 33 after losing 3 seconds in 2 laps. Around lap 48, the 2 McLarens came a cropper when Hakkinen got his braking wrong into the twiddly section at the end of the lap and ended up punting Coulthard. Coulthard had a punctured tyre and Hakkinen had to get his nose cone replaced. But what's funny about this is as DC is being spun round, he's got his middle finger up at Mika as he goes through. When the next lot of pit stops came around, Villeneuve took 3 seconds out of Damon by putting in an absolutely blinding in-lap and an absolutely blinding out-lap. So for the third stint, the two Williams cars were basically running nose to tail. At the final pit stops, Villeneuve did it again and managed to overcut Damon to be in the lead of the Grand Prix. At the start, people would have said he was out of it. Now he was leading. Villeneuve flew off into the distance, ending the race a whopping 20 seconds, near as makes no difference, ahead of Damon. And in turn he'd reduced the gap to just 9 points in the championship. It wasn't ideal because Damon finishing lower down or not at all would have been better, but it meant that with a bit of luck going his way, Jacques might take the title in his debut season. Second in the race was Hill, who would have to wait another race to take the title, while Schumacher leapfrogged Alesi in the stops to finish third, despite almost drilling in from behind into turn 3 at one point. Irvine was 5th ahead of Berger, which helped Ferrari's constructors' hopes because it was those two for the best of the rest, while Frentzen, Herbert, Brundle and Panis made up the rest of the top 10. This race is a contender for Villeneuve's best ever Grand Prix in Formula 1, and I do need to do a retrospective on the Canadian singer-songwriter and toilet door kicker inner at some point, just to see what went wrong for his career after 1997. He had to beat Damon, and did, and had to claw it back through hard racing and managing to do better than Damon on the in and out laps when it mattered. And he did that too. The title was still a long shot, but the fact he dug deep and managed to win at a track that was bad for overtaking is an achievement in itself. And he made every highlight reel for eternity with that pass on Schumacher. It was also the final race held at Estoril. It was supposed to be on the 1997 schedule and ended up in the 1997 F1 game, but it never happened. And Villeneuve almost got the helping hand that he might have wanted. After the race, reports came out that Williams had taken the gearbox out of Damon's car, and it was about to blow. If the race had been 72 laps or even 71 laps instead of 70, Villeneuve might have won the race and taken 10 points, while Damon might have taken none. Very few cars retired in this Grand Prix. So Villeneuve could have left the race with a 5-point gap, not a 9-point gap, and made Suzuka a little bit easier. But as it was, Villeneuve would have to wait another year to get his hands on the title. Much like he'd done at Estoril, he absolutely fluffed the start from pole at Suzuka and allowed Damon to head off to one of the easiest wins he'd ever have, retiring late on in the Grand Prix as his wheel flew off and ended up in the crowd. But performances like the one at Estoril 1996 showed that if the car was going to be as good in 1997 as it had been in 1996 with Newey or no Newey, then JV would be a formidable driver to beat, so long as he was consistent. That pass was something else. The rookie against the two-time world champion and the best driver on the grid at that particular time. It was something that nobody thought was possible. Like I said, Williams told him not to bother doing it because they thought he was only ever going to crash. And it's probably one of the greatest overtakes of all time, and that's a hill I will die on. Not a Damon hill I'll die on, but just a hill. But like I also said, I'd like to know what you think about that pass down in the comments. So then, a look at the 1996 Portuguese Grand Prix, where Jacques Villeneuve pulled off that pass on Michael Schumacher and made the F1 world take notice, because he was just an IndyCar driver at that point. If this has been an interesting trip down memory lane, then do give the video a like so I know I've done a good job. And for more stuff like this, get subscribed and also hit that bell thing so you never miss out on anything else to do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads over at Patreon, and if you want to help contribute to the picture purchasing piggy bank, there'll be a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. There's also super thanks for the one and done donations and memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Adam Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.